The community center buzzed with excited chatter as parents and students filed into the large auditorium. It was the annual spring recital, an event that brought together music students from across the district to showcase their talents. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of so many footsteps, and the smell of fresh coffee wafted from the lobby, where volunteers had set up a refreshment table. Rows of metal folding chairs stretched across the room, filling up quickly as proud families claimed their spots near the front. Sarah Mitchell sat near the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple navy blue dress that reached just below her knees, paired with comfortable flats. Her brown hair was pulled back into a practical bun, and she wore minimal makeup. At 32 years old, Sarah had always preferred to blend into the background rather than draw attention to herself. She taught 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary School and spent most of her free time reading books or tending to her small garden at home. She had only come to the recital because her colleague, Mrs. Henderson, had insisted. The music teacher had been organizing the event for months and personally invited all the staff members to attend. Sarah felt obligated to show support, even though classical music performances made her slightly uncomfortable. The spotlight, the attention, the pressure of performance, it all seemed overwhelming to her. She much preferred the quiet comfort of listening to music alone in her car or through headphones while grading papers. The stage at the front of the auditorium looked impressive. A beautiful grand piano sat in the center, its black lacquer surface gleaming under the warm stage lights. The instrument had been donated to the community center just 3 years ago by a wealthy local businessman whose daughter had fallen in love with music. Heavy velvet curtains framed the stage, and a microphone stood ready for announcements. Everything was prepared for an evening of youthful talent and artistic expression. Mrs. Henderson, an energetic woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, stepped onto the stage. She wore a flowing burgundy dress and smiled warmly at the assembled crowd. Tapping the microphone twice to ensure it was working, she began her welcome speech. She thanked everyone for coming and expressed her pride in the students who had worked so hard to prepare for this evening. The audience applauded politely, and parents pulled out their phones to record their children's moments in the spotlight. The performances began with a nervous 8-year-old boy playing a simple version of Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star on the piano. His feet barely reached the pedals and he had to sit on 2 cushions to reach the keys properly. Despite hitting a few wrong notes, he received enthusiastic applause from the supportive audience. After him came a teenage girl who played a lovely rendition of a Mozart piece, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced confidence. One by one, students took their turns. Each performance met with warm appreciation. Sarah found herself relaxing as the evening progressed. The performances were charming, and she enjoyed seeing the young musicians express themselves through their art. Some were clearly more advanced than others, but everyone gave their best effort. She even recognized a few students from her school, waving at them discreetly when they glanced into the audience. As the recital reached its midpoint, Mrs. Henderson returned to the stage with an unusual expression on her face, a mixture of excitement and mischief that Sarah had never seen before. The music teacher cleared her throat and smiled broadly at the crowd. She announced that they had a special surprise planned for the evening, something different from the usual student performances. The audience stirred with curiosity, parents leaning forward in their seats. Mrs. Henderson explained that the community center was raising funds to provide free music lessons for underprivileged children in the area. To support this cause, they had decided to auction off a special performance. One lucky audience member would be chosen to play a piece on the magnificent grand piano, and the performance would be recorded and shared with donors to inspire future contributions. Sarah felt her stomach tighten slightly at the announcement, though she had no reason to worry. Surely they would choose someone who had volunteered or someone with known musical talent. The music teacher pulled out a small glass bowl filled with folded pieces of paper. She explained that every adult who entered the auditorium had unknowingly been assigned a number. The volunteers at the door had been keeping a discreet list. Now they would draw one number and that person would have the honor of playing for the audience. Sarah's discomfort grew. She remembered the friendly volunteer at the entrance who had checked her name off a list, though she had thought nothing of it at the time. Mrs. Henderson reached into the bowl dramatically, stirring the papers around before selecting one. She unfolded it slowly, building the suspense, then read the number aloud. 47. She looked at her assistant, who quickly consulted the list. There was a pause, some whispered conversation, and then both women looked toward the back of the auditorium. Sarah's heart sank as she realized they were looking directly at her section. The assistant pointed, and Mrs. Henderson's face lit up with delight. Sarah Mitchell. Our very own Sarah from Lincoln Elementary. Please come up to the stage. The announcement echoed through the auditorium, amplified by the microphone. Heads turned. People craned their necks to see who had been selected, and scattered applause began to build. Sarah felt frozen in her seat, her mind racing. This could not be happening. She had not touched a piano in years, more than a decade, in fact. Her last piano lesson had been in high school, and even then she had been an average student at best. She shook her head slightly, hoping Mrs. Henderson would understand and choose someone else. But the music teacher was already gesturing enthusiastically, encouraging her to come forward. Other teachers from Lincoln Elementary, scattered throughout the audience, began to clap and cheer, thinking this was a wonderful opportunity for their quiet colleague. Someone behind Sarah gently nudged her shoulder, urging her to stand. The pressure of so many expectant eyes became too much. Her face flushed red and her hands trembled as she slowly stood from her chair. The walk down the aisle felt endless. Each step toward the stage increased her panic. Her practical flats seemed to echo too loudly on the floor. She could feel hundreds of eyes following her movement, and the bright stage lights grew more intense as she approached. What would she play? Could she even remember a single complete piece? Her mind felt blank, wiped clean by sheer anxiety. Mrs. Henderson met her at the stage steps, taking her hand warmly and helping her up. The music teacher's enthusiasm seemed genuine and kind, but Sarah felt anything but comforted. Sarah stood on the stage, her legs feeling weak beneath her. The bright lights made it difficult to see the audience clearly, which was perhaps a small mercy. The faces had become a blur of shadows and expectations. Mrs. Henderson stood beside her, still holding her hand, radiating confidence that Sarah absolutely did not feel. The piano bench waited just a few feet away, the instrument itself looking far more impressive and intimidating from this close distance. Mrs. Henderson spoke into the microphone, her voice warm and encouraging. She told the audience that Sarah was a beloved teacher at Lincoln Elementary, known for her dedication to her students and her gentle nature. Sarah wanted to disappear. Being described as gentle and quiet only made her feel more inadequate for this moment. Those qualities did not translate to confident piano performance. They translated to someone who should be safely in the audience, not exposed on a stage. The music teacher finally released her hand and gestured toward the piano. Sarah moved slowly toward it, her mind still desperately searching for any piece of music she might remember completely. She had learned several simple compositions in her youth, some beginner classical pieces, a few hymns from church, some popular songs simplified for student practice. But standing here now under pressure, she could barely remember how to read music notation, let alone recall an entire piece from memory. She sat down on the bench, adjusting her position mechanically. The smooth keys felt cool under her fingertips as she lightly touched them. The piano was obviously well maintained and perfectly tuned. Any mistakes she made would ring out clearly, unmuffled by poor instrument quality. She could not blame the piano for what was about to happen. Taking a deep breath, Sarah placed her hands in the basic position she remembered from years ago. Her fingers curved slightly over the keys. Mrs. Henderson had stepped back but remained near the edge of the stage. Before Sarah could attempt anything, the music teacher spoke again, her voice filled with sudden inspiration. She announced that to make this even more special, she would select the piece for Sarah to play. The audience murmured with interest at this twist. Sarah's blood ran cold. Being allowed to choose would have at least given her the chance to play something simple, something she might halfway remember. But having the piece chosen for her removed even that small comfort. The music teacher walked to a small table at the side of the stage where sheet music had been stacked for the student performers. She browsed through the collection, taking her time, clearly enjoying the dramatic moment. Sarah remained frozen at the piano, her hands now trembling visibly on the keys. She glanced toward the exit at the side of the stage, briefly considering simply walking off, but that would cause a scene. Embarrass Mrs. Henderson, who had worked so hard on this event, and make her the subject of gossip for weeks to come. She felt trapped by her own politeness and inability to disappoint others. Mrs. Henderson returned carrying a piece of sheet music, her expression delighted. She placed it on the piano's music stand in front of Sarah, and Sarah's heart sank even further. The title at the top read Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy. Even someone with Sarah's limited piano knowledge recognized this as a serious piece of classical music. It was not a simple student exercise or a beginner's composition. This was a piece that required genuine skill, emotional interpretation, and years of practice to perform properly. The sheet music showed complex notation, flowing arpeggios, and delicate phrasing that required both technical ability and artistic sensitivity. Sarah looked up at Mrs. Henderson with barely concealed panic in her eyes, silently pleading for the teacher to reconsider. But Mrs. Henderson seemed oblivious to her distress, or perhaps chose to interpret Sarah's expression as mere performance anxiety that could be overcome with encouragement. The music teacher patted her shoulder and spoke into the microphone again, telling the audience that they were about to hear one of the most beautiful pieces in the classical piano repertoire. The audience applauded in anticipation, making Sarah's situation even worse. As Mrs. Henderson finally stepped away, leaving Sarah alone at the piano, another teacher approached the stage. Mr. Jameson, the high school music director who had been invited to attend the recital, climbed the steps carrying his own piece of sheet music. He was a tall man with a gray beard and serious expression, known in the community for his high standards and traditional approach to music education. Sarah had met him briefly at a district meeting once but did not know him well. Mr. Jameson nodded to Mrs. Henderson and then addressed Sarah directly, his voice formal and professional. He suggested that since they were showcasing challenging repertoire, perhaps Sarah should attempt something even more demanding to truly demonstrate the piano's capabilities. He placed his sheet music on top of the Debussy piece. Sarah looked down and felt her mouth go dry. The new selection was Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, a piece famous for its difficulty and dramatic intensity. The notation looked like a foreign language to her. Dense chords, rapid passages, and technical demands that would challenge even advanced pianists. Before Sarah could protest or explain that this was far beyond her abilities, a third teacher joined the growing crowd on stage. Mrs. Chen, who taught advanced music theory at the community college, added her contribution to the impromptu selection committee. She brought forth Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, another notoriously difficult piece that required years of dedicated study to master. Sarah realized with growing horror that what had started as a simple fundraising gimmick had transformed into something else entirely. The three music educators seemed to have forgotten that Sarah was just an elementary school teacher with minimal piano training from her teenage years. They had become caught up in their own enthusiasm for challenging music, perhaps seeing this as an opportunity to expose the audience to serious classical repertoire. They discussed among themselves which piece Sarah should attempt, debating the merits of each composition, as if she were a concert pianist preparing for a recital, rather than a terrified woman who could barely remember where middle C was located on the keyboard. Sarah wanted to speak up, to tell them clearly that she could not play any of these pieces, that this whole situation had gone too far, but her voice seemed to have disappeared along with her courage. The words stuck in her throat, trapped by years of conditioning to be agreeable, to not cause trouble, to meet others' expectations even when they were unreasonable. She sat motionless at the piano, her hands now resting limply in her lap, as the three educators continued their discussion just a few feet away. The audience had grown restless during this extended deliberation. Some people were checking their phones, others whispering to their neighbors, and a few children had begun to fidget in their seats. The energy in the room had shifted from anticipation to confusion and impatience. What was supposed to be a quick, charming moment had dragged on, becoming awkward and uncomfortable for everyone involved. Finally, Mr. Jameson made the executive decision. He arranged all three pieces of sheet music on the piano stand, overlapping them so Sarah could see portions of each. He announced to the audience that Sarah would perform a medley, combining elements from all three challenging pieces to create a unique performance. The audience, not understanding the absurdity of what was being asked, applauded this creative idea. They thought it sounded ambitious and impressive, not realizing they were about to witness a disaster. Sarah stared at the incomprehensible jumble of notes before her. The three pieces used different key signatures, different time signatures, and required completely different technical approaches. Even an experienced pianist would need time to prepare such an unusual arrangement. She was being asked to sight read and improvise a medley of three extremely difficult classical compositions, with no preparation, no practice, and skills that had deteriorated over more than a decade of disuse. Mrs. Henderson returned to the microphone to introduce the performance officially, her voice bright with anticipation. She explained the ambitious medley concept to the audience and praised Sarah's willingness to take on such a challenge for the sake of the fundraising effort. Sarah barely heard the words. Her mind had gone into a strange state of detached panic, as if she were watching this happen to someone else from a great distance. The piano keys seemed to swim before her eyes, and her hands felt numb and disconnected from her body. The auditorium fell completely silent. Every eye focused on Sarah as she sat at the grand piano, the three pieces of challenging sheet music arranged haphazardly on the stand before her. The stage lights felt unbearably hot, and she could feel a bead of sweat forming on her temple. Her simple navy dress suddenly felt too warm, too constricting. She wished desperately that she had never come to this recital, that she had politely declined Mrs. Henderson's invitation and stayed home with a good book and a cup of tea. Sarah's hands hovered over the keys, frozen in indecision. She knew she should say something, should explain to the audience and the teachers that this was impossible, that she could not perform what they were asking, but her throat felt tight and the words would not come. Years of being the quiet one, the accommodating one, the person who never wanted to cause a fuss had trained her to avoid confrontation even when it would be completely justified. She felt paralyzed by the expectation in the room and her own inability to disappoint others, even strangers. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. Someone in the audience coughed. A child whispered loudly to their parent, asking when the music would start. Mrs. Henderson, still standing at the edge of the stage, gave Sarah an encouraging nod and a thumbs-up gesture, completely misreading the situation as simple stage fright rather than genuine inability. Mr. Jameson and Mrs. Chen had taken seats in the front row, looking expectant and pleased with themselves for arranging such an ambitious performance. Sarah's mind raced through her limited options. She could attempt to play anything, and fail spectacularly in front of everyone. She could stand up and walk off the stage, facing the embarrassment and questions that would follow. She could try to explain that this was beyond her abilities, though that would require finding her voice and contradicting the teachers who had put her in this position. None of the options seemed good. All of them led to humiliation in one form or another. She looked down at her hands on the keys, noticing details she had never paid attention to before. Her fingernails were cut short and practical, no polish or decoration. Her hands showed the signs of her real work, chalk dust permanently embedded in the tiny lines of her palms, a paper-cut healing on her index finger, calluses from holding pencils and markers for hours each day. These were the hands of a teacher, not a performer. They belonged at a desk or a chalkboard, not on a concert piano stage. Taking a shaky breath, Sarah decided she had to try something. Doing nothing was not an option anymore. The silence had lasted too long and people were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats. She chose to ignore the complex sheet music in front of her, and instead reached back into her memory for the simplest piece she could recall from her childhood lessons. It was a basic exercise called The Entertainer by Scott Joplin, simplified for beginners. She had practiced it hundreds of times as a young student. Her right hand found the starting position, and she pressed the first few notes. The sound that emerged from the beautiful grand piano was clear and pure, though her playing was hesitant and mechanical. She managed about 8 bars of the familiar ragtime melody before her memory failed her. Her fingers stumbled, hitting wrong notes, and then stopped completely. The partial performance hung in the air, obviously incomplete and amateurish. A few people in the audience gave sympathetic applause, but it died out quickly when they realized she had not finished. Mrs. Henderson hurried over, her expression confused. She spoke quietly to Sarah, though the microphone picked up some of her words. She gently reminded Sarah that she was supposed to be playing the medley they had selected, not a ragtime piece. She encouraged Sarah to look at the sheet music and give it a proper attempt. The music teacher still did not seem to understand that Sarah genuinely could not read or perform the complex pieces arranged on the stand. She thought Sarah was simply being modest or nervous. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes but fought them back desperately. She would not cry on stage in front of all these people. That would be the final humiliation. She turned to look at Mrs. Henderson directly and opened her mouth to explain. To finally find the courage to say she could not do this. But before she could speak, a commotion at the back of the auditorium drew everyone's attention. The main doors had opened, and a group of people entered, led by someone carrying professional camera equipment. They moved quickly down the center aisle, and the audience parted to let them through. Mrs. Henderson straightened up, looking surprised and pleased. She whispered to Sarah that this was the local news crew she had contacted about covering the fundraising event. They had said they might come if their schedule allowed, and apparently they had made it after all. Sarah's stomach dropped even further. Now her failure would potentially be broadcast on the evening news. The news crew set up quickly and efficiently at the front of the auditorium, the camera operator finding the best angle to capture both Sarah at the piano and the audience. A reporter, a young woman in a professional suit with perfectly styled hair, consulted briefly with Mrs. Henderson, getting information about what was happening. The music teacher, energized by the media attention, returned to the microphone and announced to everyone that they were now being filmed for a special segment about arts education and community fundraising. The audience murmured with excitement, people straightening in their seats and making sure they looked presentable for the camera. Sarah wanted to sink through the floor. This nightmare kept getting worse. Now there would be permanent video evidence of her failure, potentially shared on social media and news websites. People at her school would see it. Her students' parents would see it. Everyone would know that Sarah Mitchell, the quiet fourth-grade teacher, had frozen up on stage and been unable to play the piano despite being asked. She imagined the sympathetic look she would receive in the teacher's lounge, the awkward conversations, the well-meaning but embarrassing attempts to make her feel better about the whole situation. The reporter gave a signal. The camera's red light turned on and Mrs. Henderson began speaking into the microphone again. She reintroduced the performance for the news audience, explaining the fundraising goal and describing how they had randomly selected a lucky audience member to perform on the beautiful donated piano. She gestured to Sarah with flourish, building up the moment, describing the ambitious medley of classical masterpieces that would now be performed. The reporter looked impressed, clearly not a classical music expert herself, but understanding that this was supposed to be something special. Sarah realized with absolute clarity that she was out of options. She could not walk away now. Not with cameras rolling and a live audience watching and 3 music educators expecting her to perform. Her modest nature, her desire to avoid conflict, and her fear of disappointing others had trapped her in an impossible situation. She was going to have to attempt to play these pieces that she could not possibly perform competently, and everyone was going to witness her complete failure. There would be no escape, no graceful exit. She turned back to the piano, her vision slightly blurred from the tears she was still fighting back. The sheet music seemed to mock her with its complex notation and demanding technical requirements. Her hands returned to the keys, shaking visibly now. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out the expectant silence of the room. This was it. This was the moment where her quiet, comfortable life would be shattered by public humiliation. All because she had been too polite to say no when she should have. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find some inner strength or calm that might help her through the next few minutes. She thought about her students, about how she always encouraged them to try their best even when things were difficult. She thought about the courage it took for them to stand in front of the class and give presentations or solve problems on the board. Maybe she could channel even a fraction of that bravery now, even if it meant failing spectacularly. She opened her eyes and made a decision. She would attempt to play something even if it was wrong, even if it was terrible. Sarah's trembling fingers touched the keys, and she pressed down on what she hoped was the opening chord of Clair de Lune. The sound that emerged was discordant, clearly wrong. She had misremembered the starting notes entirely. She tried to adjust, moving her hands to a different position, but the result was no better. The beautiful grand piano was producing sounds that seemed to clash and jar against each other, rather than flowing into the gentle, moonlight-inspired melody that Debussy had intended. She glanced down at the sheet music, trying to sight-read the notes, but her skills were too rusty. The notation swam before her eyes, and her brain could not process the information quickly enough to translate it into hand movements. She played a few more notes, random and disconnected, hoping that somehow muscle memory might kick in and save her. It did not. Each sound she produced seemed worse than the last, and she could feel the audience's growing confusion and discomfort. People began to shift in their seats, no longer just from restlessness, but from genuine concern about what they were witnessing. This was not the inspiring performance they had been led to expect. This was painful to watch and painful to hear. Some parents looked at each other with raised eyebrows, wondering if this was some kind of experimental artistic performance they did not understand. Others showed clear sympathy on their faces, recognizing a fellow human being in distress. Sarah's face burned with embarrassment. She could feel the heat radiating from her cheeks, and she knew she must be bright red by now. Her hands continued their awkward attempt at playing, but she had completely lost any sense of rhythm or melody. She was just hitting keys now, hoping desperately that somehow this nightmare would end. The news camera captured everything, its red light a constant reminder that this moment was being preserved forever. Then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in her scattered thoughts, a memory surfaced. It was not a memory of piano playing, but of something her father had told her when she was a child learning the instrument. He had said that music was not about perfection, but about feeling, about expressing something real and honest. He had told her that the best musicians were not always the most technically skilled, but the ones who could touch something true inside themselves and share it with others. Sarah stopped playing entirely. Her hands lifted from the keys, and the auditorium fell silent again. She sat very still, her eyes closed, breathing deeply. In that moment of stillness, something shifted inside her. The panic and embarrassment were still there, but underneath them, she found something else. A quiet core of authenticity that she had buried under years of trying to be modest, unobtrusive, and agreeable. She thought about who she really was, not who others expected her to be. When Sarah opened her eyes, she looked different. There was a calmness in her expression that had not been there before. She turned slightly toward Mrs. Henderson and the other teachers, and she spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear, amplified by the microphone that had been clipped to the piano earlier. She told them honestly that she could not play the pieces they had selected. She explained that she had not seriously played piano in over 12 years, and that even when she was studying, she had only reached an intermediate level at best. The honesty in her voice seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. Mrs. Henderson's expression changed from confusion to understanding, and then to something that looked like regret. The music teacher realized that she had made a terrible assumption, caught up in her enthusiasm for the event without considering Sarah's actual abilities or comfort level. Mr. Jameson and Mrs. Chen also looked uncomfortable, understanding that their contribution to the situation had made things worse rather than better. Sarah continued speaking, her voice growing slightly stronger. She told the audience that she had been too afraid to speak up earlier, too worried about disappointing people or causing a scene. She admitted that she had tried to force herself to perform something impossible because she did not want to let anyone down. But she said that standing here now, having attempted and failed, she realized that pretending to be something you are not helps nobody. Authenticity matters more than meeting unrealistic expectations. The auditorium remained completely silent as she spoke, everyone hanging on her words. This was no longer about a piano performance. This had become something more meaningful, a real human moment of vulnerability and truth. The news camera continued to roll, but now it was capturing something far more interesting than an amateur piano recital. It was documenting genuine emotion and honest self-reflection. Sarah turned back to the piano, her hands resting gently on the keys. She said quietly into the microphone that while she could not play Debussy or Rachmaninoff or Chopin, she could play something simple and real. She could share the one complete piece she remembered from her childhood lessons, played imperfectly, but honestly. If the audience was willing to listen to that instead of the complicated medley, she would play it for them. Mrs. Henderson, now standing near the front of the stage with tears in her eyes, nodded encouragingly. She spoke into her own microphone, telling Sarah that they would be honored to hear whatever she wished to play. The music teacher apologized both to Sarah and to the audience for creating pressure and expectations that were unfair. She said that this event was supposed to celebrate music and community, not to force anyone into an uncomfortable spotlight. The audience responded with warm applause, showing their support for Sarah's honesty and their understanding of what had happened. They were no longer expecting a virtuoso performance. They were simply present for a real human being sharing something genuine with them. The shift in energy was palpable, the tension releasing into something more compassionate and connected. Sarah took another deep breath and placed her hands on the keys in the familiar starting position. She began to play Hymn to Joy, the melody, based on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but arranged simply for beginner pianists. It was a piece she had learned when she was 13 years old, played at a church recital, and practiced so many times that her fingers still remembered the movements even after all these years. The music that emerged was simple and unhurried. Sarah played slowly, carefully, making sure each note was clear and intentional. She made a few small mistakes, hitting adjacent keys occasionally, or hesitating briefly when her memory faltered, but she did not stop or restart. She played through, the errors maintaining the gentle flow of the melody. The piece was basic compared to the complex compositions that had been suggested, but it had a sweetness and sincerity that more complicated music might have lacked. As she played, Sarah felt something unexpected. She felt peaceful. The shame and embarrassment began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet satisfaction in doing something real and honest. She was not pretending to be a concert pianist or trying to impress anyone. She was just a regular person sharing a simple piece of music that meant something to her. The melody spoke of joy and gratitude, themes that felt appropriate for this strange and transformative moment. The audience listened in complete silence, no longer restless or uncomfortable. Children stopped fidgeting. Adults put away their phones. Everyone was simply present, listening to this modest woman play a modest piece of music with unexpected grace. The sound filled the auditorium, not with technical brilliance or dramatic flourishes, but with something more valuable: genuine human expression without pretense or performance. The news camera continued to record, but the reporter had lowered her notepad. She was no longer thinking about how to frame this story for the evening broadcast. She was simply experiencing the moment like everyone else in the room, moved by something ineffable and real. The camera operator kept filming, instinctively, knowing that this was the kind of authentic content that truly resonates with viewers. Sarah played the final notes of the hymn, letting them ring out clearly before gently lifting her hands from the keys. The last sound faded into silence, and for a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the applause began, starting softly and building into something powerful and sustained. People were not applauding technical skill or impressive difficulty. They were applauding courage, honesty, and the vulnerability of someone who had found herself and her voice in an unexpected moment. Sarah stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling steadier than they had when she first walked onto the stage. The applause continued, waves of sound washing over her from all directions. She looked out at the audience and saw faces she had not been able to see before when she was frozen with panic. She saw parents smiling warmly at her, teenagers who had been bored earlier now paying attention, and young children clapping enthusiastically because they understood that something important had happened, even if they could not articulate exactly what it was. Mrs. Henderson approached and embraced Sarah, whispering an apology directly in her ear. The music teacher admitted that she had gotten carried away with her enthusiasm and had not stopped to consider Sarah's actual experience or comfort level. She promised to never put anyone in such a position again, without clear communication and consent. Sarah hugged her back, understanding that the teacher's intentions had been good even if the execution had been flawed. Sometimes well-meaning people make mistakes, and forgiveness becomes part of moving forward. The news reporter approached the stage, microphone in hand, and asked if Sarah would be willing to do a brief interview about what had just happened. Sarah surprised herself by agreeing. The old Sarah, the one who always avoided attention and spotlight, would have declined politely and hurried away. But something had changed during those minutes at the piano. She had discovered that speaking her truth, even when it was uncomfortable, felt better than hiding behind politeness and false modesty. The interview was conducted right there on the stage, with the audience still seated and listening. The reporter asked Sarah what she had been feeling when she first sat down at the piano, and Sarah answered honestly. She described the panic, the sense of being trapped by her own inability to disappoint others, and the overwhelming fear of public failure. She talked about how she had always been someone who avoided conflict and attention, how she had spent her life trying to blend into the background and meet everyone's expectations except her own. The reporter then asked about the moment when things shifted, when Sarah stopped trying to play the impossible pieces and instead spoke her truth. Sarah thought carefully before answering. She explained that she had reached a breaking point where continuing the pretense became more painful than facing the embarrassment of admission. She said that in that moment of complete failure, when everything she feared was happening in front of cameras and crowds, she found an unexpected freedom. There was nothing left to lose, so she might as well be honest. The audience listened intently to this impromptu interview, many nodding in recognition. Sarah's experience resonated with people because everyone has felt trapped by expectations at some point, forced into situations where they felt inadequate but too polite to speak up. Her story was universal, even though the specific circumstances were unique. Parents thought about times they had pushed their children too hard. Teachers thought about students they might have pressured unnecessarily. Everyone saw themselves in some aspect of what had unfolded. The reporter's final question was about the simple hymn Sarah had played and why she chose it. Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time that evening. She explained that Hymn to Joy was the first complete piece she had ever performed in public, at a small church recital when she was 13. Her father had been in the audience that day, one of the last events they attended together before he passed away from cancer 6 months later. Playing that piece tonight had connected her to that memory, to a time when she played music for the simple joy of it, rather than to impress anyone. This personal revelation brought tears to many eyes in the audience, including the reporters. The story had evolved from an awkward situation into something profoundly moving. What had started as a fundraising gimmick had become a lesson in authenticity, vulnerability, and the courage to be honest even when it is difficult. The news crew had captured something far more valuable than they expected when they arrived to film a community recital. After the interview concluded, something remarkable happened. One by one, other adults in the audience began to raise their hands. They wanted to share their own stories of times when they had been pushed into uncomfortable situations, forced to pretend they had abilities they did not possess, or pressured to meet expectations that were unreasonable. The recital transformed into an unexpected community gathering where people shared honest experiences and offered support to each other. A businessman in an expensive suit stood up and admitted that he had been faking confidence in board meetings for years, always terrified that someone would discover he did not really understand half of what was being discussed. A stay-at-home mother confessed that she felt constant pressure to be the perfect parent, but often had no idea what she was doing and was just trying her best. A teenage boy said he had joined the football team because everyone expected it, but he actually hated sports and wanted to study theater instead. Mrs. Henderson, still on stage, made a decision in that moment. She announced that the fundraising goal for free music lessons was important, but even more important was creating a community where people felt safe to be themselves, to try new things without fear of harsh judgment, and to admit when something was beyond their abilities. She suggested that future recitals include a mix of polished performances and honest attempts, celebrating both skill and courage in equal measure. The other music educators, Mr. Jameson and Mrs. Chen, also approached the microphone. They both apologized publicly for their role in creating the uncomfortable situation. Mr. Jameson admitted that in his pursuit of musical excellence, he sometimes forgot that music should be accessible and enjoyable for people at all skill levels, not just advanced students. Mrs. Chen acknowledged that she had been so focused on showcasing difficult repertoire that she had lost sight of the human being sitting at the piano. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The remaining student performances were met with even warmer applause than before because everyone in the audience now understood that what mattered was not perfection, but genuine effort and personal expression. A young violinist who struggled through a simple folk tune received a standing ovation. A group of middle school singers who forgot their lyrics halfway through their song laughed it off and started again. and the audience laughed with them in shared humanity rather than judgment. Sarah remained on stage for a while, talking with people who came up to thank her for her honesty. Teachers from her school surrounded her, expressing support and sharing their own stories of feeling inadequate or overwhelmed. Parents thanked her for modeling vulnerability and authenticity for their children, showing that adults also struggle, and that admitting difficulty is not weakness, but strength. Students from Lincoln Elementary who were present hugged their teacher and told her they thought she was brave. The news crew filmed additional footage of these interactions, the reporter recognizing that the story had grown beyond a single moment into something that captured a larger truth about community, expectation, and authenticity. She interviewed several other people about their reactions to what they had witnessed, and everyone spoke about being moved and inspired. The segment would eventually air not just on local news, but would be picked up by national media outlets, resonating with viewers across the country who recognized their own struggles in Sarah's experience. As the evening drew to a close and people began to leave the auditorium, Sarah finally made her way off the stage. She felt exhausted but also strangely energized. The ordeal had been terrible while it was happening, but something valuable had emerged from it. She had discovered a voice she did not know she possessed, a capacity for honesty and self-advocacy that had been buried under years of accommodation and conflict avoidance. Mrs. Henderson walked with Sarah toward the exit, carrying the sheet music that had caused so much trouble earlier. She looked at the complex pieces and shook her head ruefully, admitting that she had been completely out of touch with reality when she and the other teachers selected such difficult repertoire. She asked Sarah what she wanted her to do with the music. Sarah took the sheets, looked at them for a moment, and then smiled. She said she would keep them as a reminder, not of failure, but of the night she found her courage. The weekend following the recital was strange for Sarah. She woke up Saturday morning expecting to feel embarrassed about everything that had happened, bracing herself for the regret and self-criticism that usually followed any moment where she had drawn attention to herself. Instead, she felt surprisingly calm and even a bit proud. She made her morning coffee and sat in her small garden, watching birds visit the feeder she had hung from a tree branch, and reflected on how different she felt compared to just 2 days ago. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently since late Friday night. Text messages from colleagues, friends she had not heard from in years, and even a few former students who had heard about what happened. All the messages were supportive and kind, many sharing their own stories similar to what people had done at the recital. Her cousin in another state sent a long text about how she had been pressured into giving a speech at a company event, despite her fear of public speaking, and how Sarah's story had made her feel less alone in that experience. On Sunday afternoon, Sarah received a phone call from the news reporter who had filmed the recital. The woman introduced herself as Jennifer Martinez and asked if Sarah had seen the segment that aired on Friday's evening news. Sarah admitted she had not watched it because she did not own a television and rarely watched news online. Jennifer laughed warmly and said that was probably for the best, though she thought Sarah would appreciate knowing that the response had been overwhelmingly positive. Jennifer explained that after the local broadcast, the story had been shared on the station's social media accounts and had gone viral within hours. Thousands of people had commented, sharing their own experiences of being pushed beyond their comfort zones or feeling pressured to perform in ways they could not manage. The story had struck a chord with viewers far beyond their small community. National news websites had picked it up, and several morning talk shows had expressed interest in featuring the story. Sarah felt a flutter of renewed anxiety at hearing this. She had made peace with being honest in front of a few hundred people at a community center, but the idea of her story being shared nationally felt overwhelming. Jennifer sensed her hesitation over the phone and quickly reassured her. The reporter said that while several shows wanted to interview Sarah, she was under no obligation to agree to any of them. Jennifer emphasized that Sarah had already done the brave thing, and anything else was entirely her choice to make or decline without guilt. They talked for nearly an hour, two women who had only briefly met, but who found an unexpected connection through the unusual circumstances. Jennifer shared her own story of feeling pressured in her career to cover stories in certain ways, or to present herself differently than she felt comfortable with. She said that witnessing Sarah's moment of authentic vulnerability had reminded her why she had wanted to become a journalist in the first place. To tell real human stories that matter, not just to chase dramatic footage or shocking headlines. By Monday morning, when Sarah returned to Lincoln Elementary School, she expected some awkwardness or attention from her fellow teachers. She arrived early, as she always did, and was making copies of worksheets in the teacher's lounge when Mrs. Henderson found her. The music teacher looked sheepish but also relieved to see her. She apologized again for the situation she had created, and told Sarah that she had spent the entire weekend rethinking how she organized events and involved people. The school day began normally enough, with students arriving in their usual chaotic morning rush of backpacks, lunchboxes, and excited chatter. But as Sarah's fourth-grade students settled into their seats, she noticed they were looking at her differently. Several of them had expressions that seemed almost proud, as if their teacher had done something remarkable. It turned out that many of their parents had seen the news segment or heard about it through community gossip. During morning circle time, when Sarah usually asked students to share something from their weekend, a shy girl named Emma raised her hand tentatively. Emma was one of the quietest students in the class, someone who rarely volunteered to speak and often seemed anxious about classroom participation. She told the class that her mom had shown her the video of Mrs. Mitchell at the recital, and it had made her feel better about being nervous when she had to read aloud in class. Emma said that knowing even teachers get scared sometimes helped her feel less weird about her own fears. This opened up a conversation that Sarah had not anticipated, but found deeply meaningful. Other students began sharing their own experiences of feeling pressured to do things they were not ready for, or being afraid to admit when something was too difficult. A boy named Marcus talked about how his older brothers always made fun of him for not being good at basketball, even though he tried really hard. A girl named Sophia admitted that she pretended to understand math problems, sometimes even when she was completely confused because she did not want to seem dumb. Sarah found herself facilitating a classroom discussion about honesty, vulnerability, and the courage it takes to admit when you need help or when something is beyond your current abilities. She shared more details about her experience at the recital, explaining how scared she had been and how hard it was to finally speak up and tell the truth. She emphasized that being honest about your limitations is not the same as giving up or not trying. It is about being realistic and authentic so you can get the support you actually need. The lesson that morning evolved into something entirely different from what she had planned. Instead of math worksheets, they talked about emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Instead of reading comprehension exercises, they discussed communication and advocacy. Sarah realized that this unplanned lesson might be one of the most important things she taught all year, and it had emerged directly from her willingness to be vulnerable and real with her students, rather than maintaining a perfect, unflappable teacher persona. At lunch, the teacher's lounge was buzzing with conversation about the weekend news. Several teachers approached Sarah to tell her they had seen the segment and found it moving or inspiring. The vice principal, Mr. Thompson, mentioned that he had received several calls from parents expressing appreciation for having teachers like Sarah, who modeled authenticity for their children. He said the district superintendent had even called to say she thought the incident, while awkward, had ultimately reflected well on the school's values of honesty and community. Not everyone's response was entirely positive, though. Mrs. Whitmore, an older teacher who had been at Lincoln Elementary for 30 years and valued tradition and decorum, made a pointed comment about how in her day, teachers maintained professional boundaries and did not share personal struggles with students or the public. She suggested that Sarah's emotional display had been somewhat inappropriate and unprofessional. Even if well-intentioned, Sarah felt the familiar urge to apologize, to shrink back and agree that maybe Mrs. Whitmore was right, that she had overstepped somehow. But something was different now. Instead of immediately deferring to the older teacher's judgment, Sarah took a breath and calmly explained her perspective. She said that she believed authenticity and emotional honesty, when appropriate, could strengthen the relationship between teachers and students rather than diminish professional respect. She acknowledged that Mrs. Whitmore might see things differently based on her experience and values. And that was okay. People could disagree about these things. Mrs. Whitmore looked surprised by Sarah's measured but firm response. She was accustomed to Sarah being the accommodating one who avoided any disagreement. After a moment of consideration, the older teacher simply nodded and changed the subject, seeming to recognize that Sarah was not going to be swayed by implied criticism. This small interaction felt significant to Sarah, Another example of how something had fundamentally shifted in how she related to the world, and especially to authority figures or strong personalities. That afternoon, during her planning period, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her early 50s knocked on her classroom door and introduced herself as Patricia Green. She explained that she was a piano teacher in the community and that she had been in the audience at the recital. Patricia said she had been deeply moved by what she witnessed and wanted to talk with Sarah if she had a few minutes. They sat at the small reading table in the corner of Sarah's classroom, and Patricia explained that she had been teaching piano for over 25 years. She said that Sarah's experience had made her reflect seriously on her own teaching methods and the expectations she placed on students. She admitted that she sometimes pushed students to perform pieces that were too advanced, thinking it would challenge them to grow, without adequately considering whether they were truly ready or willing to face that challenge in a public setting. Patricia said she wanted to do something to acknowledge what Sarah had been through and to make amends for what she felt was a failure of the music education community to protect someone from an unreasonable situation. She offered to give Sarah free piano lessons if she was interested, with no pressure or expectations. Just an opportunity to reconnect with music on her own terms at her own pace. She emphasized that Sarah could decline the offer without any offense taken. Sarah accepted Patricia's offer, and they agreed to start with weekly lessons on Thursday evenings at Patricia's home studio. The first lesson was scheduled for the following week, and Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and genuine curiosity about returning to the piano. This time would be different, she told herself. This time she would be learning for herself at her own pace with no pressure to perform or impress anyone. She would be honest with Patricia about her limitations and her goals, which were simply to enjoy music rather than to achieve any particular level of mastery. The story that had begun so awkwardly at the community center recital continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. By midweek, Sarah received an email from a woman named Dr. Lisa Chen, a psychology professor at the State University who specialized in social anxiety and performance pressure. Dr. Chen explained that she had seen the news segment and was fascinated by Sarah's experience from a research perspective. She asked if Sarah would be willing to participate in a study about how people navigate social pressure and find authentic self-expression in challenging situations. Sarah agreed to meet with Dr. Chen for coffee on Saturday morning at a quiet cafe near campus. The professor was warm and engaging, immediately putting Sarah at ease. They talked for over 2 hours about psychology, education, social expectations, and the many ways people hide their true selves to meet perceived demands from others. Dr. Chen shared research about how common Sarah's experience was. Most people regularly find themselves in situations where they feel pressured to pretend they have knowledge, skills, or confidence they do not actually possess. The professor explained that what made Sarah's story remarkable was not that she found herself in that situation, which was actually quite ordinary, but that she had the courage to break the pattern and speak her truth despite all the social and emotional pressure to continue pretending. Dr. Chen said that most people, when trapped in a similar scenario, would force themselves to muddle through somehow, continuing the performance even at great personal cost, rather than risk the vulnerability of honest admission. Sarah's choice to be authentic had created an opportunity for everyone present to examine their own relationship with expectation and pretense. Dr. Chen asked if Sarah would be willing to write about her experience for an academic article the professor was preparing on authenticity and performance anxiety. Sarah hesitated at first, feeling inadequate to contribute to academic work, but then caught herself falling back into old patterns of self-doubt. She realized that this was exactly the kind of thing the new Sarah, the one who had found her voice on that stage, would say yes to. She agreed to try, with the understanding that Dr. Chen would help her shape her personal narrative into something suitable for the academic context. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life settled into a new normal that felt both familiar and distinctly different from before. She continued teaching her 4th grade class with renewed confidence, finding that her willingness to be vulnerable with students had created a classroom environment where they felt safer being vulnerable too. Academic performance actually improved because students were more willing to admit when they did not understand something rather than pretending and falling further behind. Her weekly piano lessons with Patricia became a cherished part of her routine. They progressed slowly through simple pieces, and Patricia frequently reminded Sarah that there was no timeline, no recital they were preparing for, no external standard they needed to meet. Sarah found herself actually enjoying the piano in a way she never had as a teenager. Back then, lessons had been about pleasing her teacher and her parents, about completing assigned pieces and passing grade levels. Now music was simply about the pleasure of making sounds, of feeling her fingers move across keys, of losing herself in melody for its own sake. The news segment about the recital continued to have a life of its own online. Months after the original broadcast, people were still finding and sharing the video, commenting on how much they related to Sarah's experience. Some viewers shared stories of being forced to give presentations at work when they were unprepared, of being called on in classroom settings when they did not know the answer, of being expected to have expertise they did not possess. The video had become a touchstone for conversations about authenticity, social pressure, and the courage required to be honest about limitations. Sarah received occasional interview requests from podcasts, magazines, and online publications wanting to feature her story. She declined most of them, feeling that she had said what she needed to say and did not want to become defined by this one incident. However, she did agree to speak at a local TEDx event about authenticity and finding your voice. The talk was scheduled for 6 months after the recital, giving her time to process everything that had happened and to gain perspective on what the experience had taught her. Preparing for the TEDx talk pushed Sarah to articulate clearly what had changed in her life since that evening at the community center. She realized that the shift was not really about piano playing or public performance. It was about fundamentally changing her relationship with other people's expectations and with her own fear of disappointing them. She had spent most of her life trying to be what others needed her to be, saying yes to things she did not want to do, avoiding conflict or disagreement, and shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were not really meant for her. The recital had been a breaking point where the cost of that pattern became too high. In trying to meet impossible expectations, she had faced complete failure anyway, which taught her that the thing she feared most, public humiliation and judgment, was not actually as devastating as she had imagined. Yes, it was uncomfortable. Yes, it was embarrassing. But she had survived it, and more than that, she had found something valuable in the wreckage. Her authentic voice and the realization that being honest, even when it is hard, connects you to people more deeply than performing a perfect facade ever could. The TEDx talk went surprisingly well. Sarah spoke without notes for 18 minutes, telling her story with humor and insight and vulnerability. She talked about the difference between modesty and self-erasure, about how being accommodating is not the same as being kind, and about how saying no or admitting limitation is actually a form of respect for yourself and for others. The audience responded with a standing ovation, and the video of her talk was eventually viewed by millions of people online, reaching far beyond what the original news segment had achieved. At Lincoln Elementary, Sarah gradually took on new roles that reflected her evolved sense of self. She started a support group for teachers who struggled with work-life balance and boundary setting. She helped develop new policies around consent and choice in school performances, ensuring that students and staff were never pressured to participate in ways that felt unsafe or uncomfortable. She became known not as the quiet teacher who never made waves, but as someone who spoke truth thoughtfully and advocated effectively for authentic human connection. Her friendship with Mrs. Henderson also deepened and evolved. The music teacher had done serious reflection on how she organized events and involved community members. She implemented new procedures that included clear communication about expectations, opt-in rather than random selection for special performances, and multiple ways for people to contribute according to their actual abilities and comfort levels. The two women sometimes laughed together about that night, acknowledging how a well-intentioned mistake had catalyzed so much unexpected growth for both of them. Sarah continued her piano lessons with Patricia for over 2 years. She never became an advanced pianist, and she was perfectly at peace with that. She learned to play a modest repertoire of pieces that brought her joy: simple classical melodies, folk songs, hymns, and popular tunes. Patricia sometimes invited Sarah to informal gatherings where her students played for each other in a relaxed, supportive environment. Sarah participated in a few of these, playing her simple pieces without anxiety, enjoying the act of sharing music rather than performing it. The most significant change, though, was internal. Sarah noticed it in small moments throughout her days. When a colleague asked her to take on extra work that she did not have time for, she said no calmly and without apologizing. When her principal suggested she might want to dress more formally for parent-teacher conferences, she thanked him for the feedback, but continued wearing what felt comfortable and professional to her. When her mother criticized her life choices during a phone call, Sarah gently but firmly redirected the conversation rather than absorbing the criticism silently as she once would have. She was not perfect at maintaining boundaries or speaking her truth. Old habits sometimes resurfaced, and she would catch herself agreeing to things she did not want to do or minimizing her own needs to accommodate others. But now she noticed these patterns when they emerged, and she could course correct. She had developed what she thought of as an internal compass that helped her distinguish between genuine kindness and self-erasure, between healthy flexibility and harmful accommodation. 3 years after the recital, Sarah was approached about writing a book based on her experience and the broader themes of authenticity and finding your voice.